By the summer of 1945, the world had been consumed by the flames of the Second World War for nearly 6 years. The conflict, which began in Europe, had spread across the globe, drawing nations into a vast and devastating struggle. In the Pacific, the United States and its allies were locked in a brutal island-hopping campaign against the Empire of Japan. Each battle from Iwo Jima to Okinawa was marked by ferocious fighting and staggering casualties on both sides. The Japanese military, guided by a warrior code that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor, demonstrated a willingness to fight to the very last person. This fierce resistance raised the terrifying prospect of a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland, an operation that military planners predicted would cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. It was against this backdrop of escalating violence and fear that a secret project of unprecedented scale was nearing its completion in the United States. This endeavor was known as the Manhattan Project. It had begun years earlier, spurred by a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, co-signed by the brilliant physicist Albert Einstein. The letter warned that Nazi Germany might be developing a new type of extraordinarily powerful bomb based on the principles of nuclear fission. The fear that Adolf Hitler could possess such a weapon first compelled American scientists to race against a hidden clock, to unlock the atom's destructive power before their enemies could. The project brought together some of the world's most brilliant scientific minds, working in hidden cities and secret laboratories across the country. The goal of the Manhattan Project was singular and monumental: to build a functional atomic bomb. Under the scientific direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer and the military oversight of General Leslie Groves, thousands of people worked tirelessly, often without knowing the true purpose of their labor. They were pioneers on a frightening new frontier of science and warfare. By July 1945 they had succeeded. In the stark desert of New Mexico, at a site named Trinity, the world's first atomic device was detonated. The test produced a blast of unimaginable power, creating a mushroom cloud that rose miles into the sky. Oppenheimer, watching the spectacle, famously recalled a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The weapon was ready. With Germany having surrendered in May, the sole remaining target for this new weapon was Japan. The war in the Pacific raged on, and the Allied forces were preparing for the final, bloody chapter. The leaders of the Allied powers, including the new American president, Harry S. Truman, now faced a decision of immense gravity. They possessed a weapon that could potentially force a swift end to the war, but its use would unleash a form of destruction never before seen on a human population. The stage was set for a moment that would alter the course of history, as the leaders weighed the strategic imperatives of war against the profound moral implications of their new and terrible power. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima was a bustling urban center, its residents beginning their day as usual. The sky was clear and blue. At 8:15 a.m., an American B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay flew high above the city and released its payload. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was an atomic device fueled by uranium. It detonated about 1,900 feet above the ground, creating a blinding flash of light and a massive fireball that was said to be hotter than the surface of the sun. In an instant, the blast wave and intense heat obliterated the city center, flattening buildings and igniting a firestorm that consumed what remained. Tens of thousands of people were killed instantly, vaporized by the heat or crushed by collapsing structures. The immediate aftermath was a scene of almost indescribable horror. Those who survived the initial blast were left to wander through a surreal landscape of rubble and flame, many suffering from horrific burns and other severe injuries. The city's infrastructure was annihilated, with hospitals destroyed and medical personnel killed, leaving the wounded with little hope of aid. People desperately sought water to quench their thirst and soothe their burns, unaware that the city's rivers were now filled with debris and the dead. In the days and weeks that followed, thousands more would die from their injuries and the insidious effects of radiation sickness, a new and terrifying illness that caused symptoms like hair loss, bleeding, and a slow, painful death. Despite the unprecedented destruction of Hiroshima, the Japanese government did not immediately surrender. Some military leaders remained defiant, believing the United States could not possess more than one such weapon. 3 days later, on August 9th, the United States acted again. The target this time was the city of Nagasaki, a major industrial port. A second B-29 Boxcar carried a plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man. Cloud cover over the primary target, Kokura, forced the plane to divert to Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb was dropped. Although the city's hilly terrain somewhat contained the blast, the destruction was still immense. The bomb leveled the northern part of the city, killing an estimated 40,000 to 74,000 people. The combined shock of two cities being annihilated in such a manner, coupled with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan on the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, finally broke the stalemate within the Japanese leadership. The Emperor Hirohito intervened. In an unprecedented radio address to the Japanese people on August 15th, he announced his decision to accept the Allied terms of surrender, citing the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb. The war, which had claimed the lives of tens of millions, was finally over. But for the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as the Hibakusha, the suffering was just beginning, as they would carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The decision made by President Harry S. Truman to use the atomic bombs remains one of the most intensely debated actions in modern history. The primary reason given by the US government was that the bombings were a military necessity, a tool to bring the war to the quickest possible conclusion, and, in doing so, save lives. American military leaders had prepared for a massive invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, which was projected to be an extraordinarily costly campaign. Planners estimated that such an invasion could result in as many as 1 million American casualties and several million Japanese casualties, including both soldiers and civilians who were being trained to resist with rudimentary weapons. From this perspective, the bombs were seen as the lesser of two evils. Proponents of the decision argue that it was the most effective way to shock the Japanese leadership into submission. Japan's military had shown a pattern of fighting to the death, and the idea of unconditional surrender was deeply repugnant to their code of honor. Even after the devastating firebombing of Tokyo and other cities, which had killed more people than the initial blasts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese government showed little sign of capitulating. It was believed that only a demonstration of overwhelming and terrifying power could break this resolve. By using the bombs, Truman and his advisors contended that they were not only saving American lives, but also sparing the Japanese people from the prolonged agony of a conventional land invasion. However, this justification has been challenged by many historians and ethicists over the decades. Critics argue that Japan was already on the verge of collapse, and that its surrender was imminent, even without the use of atomic weapons. The Allied naval blockade had crippled the country's ability to import food and resources, and its industrial capacity was shattered. Some scholars point to intercepted Japanese communications that suggest a faction within the government was actively seeking a way to negotiate peace through the still neutral Soviet Union. In this view, the atomic bombs were not necessary to end the war, and were used on a nation that was already defeated and seeking a way out. Furthermore, a significant counter-argument revolves around the role of the Soviet Union. The Soviets had pledged to enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's defeat, and they launched their invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria on August 9th, the same day Nagasaki was bombed. Some historians argue that the Soviet entry into the war was the decisive factor that prompted Japan's surrender, as it eliminated any hope of a negotiated peace. This has led to the controversial theory that the bombs were used not just to defeat Japan, but also to intimidate the Soviet Union and establish American dominance in the post-war world order, marking the first act of the Cold War. The moral question of targeting civilian populations with such an indiscriminate weapon remains a central point of contention. The surrender of Japan on August 15, 1945 brought World War II to its official close, but the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki cast a long and enduring shadow over the future. The immediate consequence for Japan was a period of immense suffering and reconstruction under Allied occupation. The survivors, the Hibakusha, faced a lifetime of health problems, including an increased risk of cancer and other radiation-related illnesses. They also endured social stigma and discrimination as fear and misunderstanding about radiation sickness spread. The two cities, once vibrant centers of life, became global symbols of the horrors of nuclear war, their ruins serving as a stark warning to all of humanity. The bombings fundamentally altered the nature of international relations and warfare. The United States emerged from the war as the world's sole nuclear power, a position that gave it immense geopolitical leverage. However, this monopoly was short-lived. The Soviet Union, driven by a desire to match American power, successfully tested its own atomic bomb in 1949. This event triggered a terrifying arms race between the two superpowers. For the next 4 decades, the Cold War would be defined by this nuclear standoff, as both nations built vast arsenals of increasingly powerful weapons capable of destroying civilization many times over. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, became the grim logic of the era, where peace was maintained by the shared threat of total annihilation. The legacy of the atomic bombs is therefore one of deep paradox. On one hand, the weapons were credited with ending the deadliest conflict in human history. On the other, they introduced the world to an existential threat that has loomed over global politics ever since. The fear of nuclear war spurred movements for disarmament and non-proliferation as scientists, activists, and ordinary citizens campaigned to control the very weapons that science had unleashed. The events of August 1945 forced humanity to confront profound questions about the limits of scientific progress, the responsibilities of power, and the very survival of the species. The world had entered the atomic age, a new chapter where its own ingenuity had given it the capacity for self-destruction. Today, 80 years later, the debate over the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki continues, a testament to their complex and painful legacy. The world still grapples with the challenge of nuclear weapons, striving to prevent their spread and avoid their use. The stories of the survivors and the haunting images of the ruined cities serve as a constant and necessary reminder of the human cost of these weapons. They stand as a solemn plea for peace, and a warning that the decisions made in times of war can echo for generations, shaping not only the past but the future of the entire world. The nuclear shadow has not disappeared, it is a permanent part of our collective consciousness.